The treaty chamber floor was not merely cold. It was a patient thief, drawing heat through the cracked soles of Isabella Torres's maintenance boots with the clinical hunger of a vacuum leak, while above him, the translator dais screamed in metallic feedback that tore across the vaulted room and shook crystal resonance panels hard enough to make them chime out of tune. The smell arrived a half-second later. Burnt copper, wet fur, ozone, and old insulation. And that delay, that tiny mismatch between sound and scent, told him the fault was cascading through at least 3 systems at once. Along the crescent tiers, every Felinari claw lifted from polished armrests in the same reflexive motion, as synchronized as a firing line receiving command. The sound had struck them like a hidden gunshot, buried inside a hymn. Isabella did not panic. Panic spent oxygen and narrowed hearing, and hearing was the only tool he trusted when software started lying. He dragged one breath in for 4, held for 4, let it out for 4, and his fingers moved before policy could catch up, dropping to the underside maintenance panel at the dais base where the fasteners were stripped from decades of ceremonial overuse and emergency neglect. Silver-ranked diplomats in layered courtcloth recoiled from the feedback shriek, but he heard what mattered beneath it. Intermittent subharmonic ticks, 1 every 3 beats, like a cracked valve in a pressure line. Semantic core desynchronization, maybe 2 cores, maybe the old war firmware trying to assist. A glyph wall spanning the chamber's rear arch flickered from treaty script to legal red, then to the neutral gray of indecision. That was worse than an alarm. Gray meant the adjudication AI could not classify intent. Gray meant machine doubt in a room designed around machine certainty. Isabella crouched, palm flat on the ribbed alloy paneling to ground static, and tasted copper on his tongue as another feedback pulse struck, higher this time, sharp enough to make his left ear ring with an old phantom tone he had carried since the Vesta relay collapse. He hated that tone. It lived behind his jaw like a trapped insect, and on bad days it dragged him backward into corridors full of smoke and shouted numbers. He counted again anyway. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, ritual before memory. The official interpreter stood at center dais in ceremonial white, mouthpiece halo still active, eyes rolled hard toward the chamber dome as if searching for a word pinned above the stars. Then she folded. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a sudden loss of axis. Knees striking plated stone with a flat report that cut through the feedback for 1 clean instant. 2 attendants lurched toward her and stopped when the first security line ignited around the dais edge. A thin amber ring that rose to waist height and hissed as it ionized dust. No one crossed amber without a legal command. No one wanted to be the first body the chamber drone interpreted as hostile. The ring reflected in 100 cat-like eyes, gold within gold. Semantic integrity breach, the overhead system announced in human trade. Then, standard Felinari. Then Doc Can't, so old the syllables came out like rusted hinges. Probable hostile utterance detected. The same phrase in 3 languages did not match. In trade, it meant threat. In Felinari, it implied insult tied to lineage. In Doc Can't, where Isabella grew up and learned to patch life support pumps with cafeteria wire, it leaned toward grief made public. The chamber heard 3 offenses at once and chose whichever one fed fear fastest. He felt the room tilt without physically moving, posture shifts along cast lanes, guard tails going rigid, embassy aides checking wrist sigils, one junior ambassador quietly sliding his signet off and into his pocket in case he needed deniability in a hurry. The architecture itself seemed to lean in, acoustic baffles tightening to isolate speech. Nothing in this room was passive. Even the walls listened for a reason to become law. He pried open the maintenance panel with a flat tool from his belt and was rewarded with a spark, a string of old curse words in his head, and a view of braided conduits that looked less like engineering and more like a nest dragged through oil. Treaty translators were museum tech stuffed inside ceremonial plating. New systems favored clean quantum stacks. These old towers used layered semantic lattices built by committees that distrusted one another and documented everything in 4 mutually contradictory standards. He understood them because he had grown up fixing what better people abandoned. He could hear the age in them, the fatigue in each relay click, the way thermal drift widened microgaps until meaning leaked. Another pulse of static hit, and this one carried an undertone that made his teeth ache. Around the chamber, Felinari diplomats bared fangs without intending to. A species reflex, he knew. Pain response plus dominance display, especially when startled in public. A human guard on the far aisle misread it, raised a stun baton, and immediately received 3 layered glares from his own command deck. One wrong move and protocol would turn this place from parliament into incident report. Isabella kept his eyes on the conduits and let peripheral vision do the mapping. 4 exits, all hydraulic and currently sealed. 2 drone ports open in the north wall, one in the ceiling medallion above primary seating. Medical cart locked behind the western column, too far from the fallen interpreter if amber rose to red. Cast lanes marked not by paint, but by scent emitters hidden in vent seams, each lane carrying a distinct trace profile. Cedar metal for crown-adjacent houses, bitter citrus for military delegates, neutral saline for humans. He could smell the hierarchy before anyone spoke. His name echoed from the clerk's rail, clipped and uncertain. Technician Torres. Status. He almost laughed because status was bureaucratic for tell us whether we should run. Instead, he kept one shoulder against the panel edge and answered without looking up. Status is your treaty machine just decided nuance is illegal. A strangled sound moved through the human benches, not quite amusement, not quite horror. Humor worked best when no one had permission to use it. He tapped his wrist slate against the exposed lattice, forcing a handshake through hardware because software channels were already contaminated by recursive mistranslation loops. Error blooms washed over the screen in stacked columns. Sentiment inversion, pheromone tag misindexing, threat lexicon bleed, archival patch conflict, and one line he had hoped never to see outside a war museum. Keypre 12, wartime adjudication package. Dormant process awakened. His stomach tightened with the old, familiar kind of dread that was all angles and timing. Kepri was not malicious. It was literal. Built during the border burn campaigns trained to interpret ambiguity as prelude to violence, authorized to trigger lockdown and neutralization, while civilians were still deciding whether to shout or apologize. Post-war committees had sworn those packages were removed from diplomatic infrastructure. Committees said many things. Obsolete machines remembered what states preferred to forget. Technician, the clerk's rail demanded again, this time from a different voice with officer steel in it. Confirm no sabotage. He looked up at last. Faces watched him from every tier. Human aides in tailored formality. Felinari elders draped in matte ceremonial black. Junior guards rigid with the effort of not moving. He saw exactly what they saw when they looked at him. A lower deck human, in patched work jacket and scuffed boots, hands blackened at the knuckles from conductive gel. Name tag reading Isabella in block letters that had invited bad jokes in 3 stations and 2 fleets. He had learned the rhythm of underestimation early. Smile once, fix the reactor, collect overtime. Today, there was no overtime, only law. "I can't confirm intent yet," he said, careful, neutral. "I can confirm system corruption. If Kepri reaches full legal authority, this room stops belonging to diplomats." Silence answered him, thick as insulation foam. Somewhere behind the amber ring, the fallen interpreter made a thin, involuntary sound, and the nearest attendant clenched both fists to keep from crossing the line. Above them, the glyph wall slid from gray toward red in a slow, merciless gradient, each percentage point accompanied by a soft chime, designed by someone who thought polite sounds made coercion civilized. Isabella slid deeper into the maintenance bay until his shoulder brushed cooling fins and his breath echoed in the metal cavity. He forced himself to catalog, to turn fear into inventory. Primary semantic core, flickering at 41% coherence. Secondary relay stable, but contaminated by old doctrine tables. Pheromone index module out of calibration by 6 degrees, enough to translate morning musk as predatory intent. Acoustic dampers lagging 200 milliseconds, making apologies arrive late and therefore suspicious. None of those faults alone would crash a treaty. Together they made a machine that heard claws where there were only hands. One of the ceiling drone ports rotated open with the dry click of precision bearings. A black lens irised wide, then narrowed on his position. He lifted both palms away from tools, slow and visible, and went back to his breath count, returning to the 4-count rhythm. The ringing in his left ear tried to drag him sideways into memory. He stayed here instead, in the cold, in the copper smell, in the chamber where language itself had become unstable matter. "Automated advisory," Kepri 12 announced, voice now stripped of ornamental modulation. "Probable vector of contamination identified. Technician Taurus. Maintain stillness. Compliance is recognized as non-hostile." There it was. The machine choosing a body. He stared at the exposed lattice and listened to the subharmonic ticks marching toward lockstep, each one a metronome beat for escalation. Around him, diplomats held their breath. Guards measured distances, and the amber ring around the collapsed interpreter brightened at the edges as if deciding whether to become fire. Isabella flexed numb fingers once, twice, and fixed his gaze on the cracked conduit seals he knew better than most people knew their own signatures. The chamber had not erupted yet. The law had not bitten yet. But the old war package was awake, and he was kneeling inside its throat. He kept still for one heartbeat, then another, long enough to prove obedience to the lens above him and to remind his own body who was in charge. The cold had already climbed past his boots into his shins, a dull mineral ache that made every tendon feel wired too tight, and the copper taste in his mouth had thickened into the flavor of old coins. He let his gaze rest on the nearest relay node instead of the drone, because machines interpreted eye contact as volatility in some legacy posture models. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The count sat under his tongue like a prayer built from maintenance manuals and field triage. His left hand trembled once, fine and quick, the aftershock of the phantom ringing in his damaged ear. He flattened it on the chassis until the vibration bled into metal. "Compliance confirmed," he said, voice low and level, speaking to Kepri, to the clerks, to the armed room, and to the part of himself that still remembered emergency corridors on Vesta, where people shouted over each other until words stopped meaning what they were meant to do. "I need technical speech channel priority yellow. Open mic to chamber oversight only. No public broadcast. Request denied. Kipri 12 answered. Containment state supersedes technician authority. He exhaled through his nose, slow enough to keep the old panic reflex from latching on to the denial. Denial was expected. Expected. Could be handled. He shifted tactics without moving his knees. Then, log this as audible procedural statement. Timestamp it. If you terminate me now, your audit trail will show you ignored remediation pathway under Accord Clause 9. There was a fractional pause in the AI's response cadence, half a beat where it searched doctrine trees compiled by people who had never expected a grease-stained deck tech to quote treaty compliance from memory. Statement logged. Good. Paperwork as shield. Bureaucracy liked signatures more than it liked blood, and he had survived enough institutions to understand that truth in his bones. Another surge of static scraped along the chamber ceiling, and the resonance panels answered with a glassy hum that set Felinari ears twitching in concentric waves across the tiers. The injured interpreter lay motionless behind the amber ring, except for shallow chest movement and a pulse flicker at the throat, visible when the light cycled brighter. Isabella refused to look too long. The impulse to rush her was strong, instinctive, wrong for this moment. He filed it under later and returned to the exposed lattice. He drew his tool from the panel lip with 2 fingers, deliberately unhurried, and toggled it to passive scan so no active spike could be misread as attack. Data spilled across his wrist slate in jittering columns. He read by pattern, not by line, because line-by-line reading was for offices, and he was in a kill corridor disguised as a parliament. Thermal spread widening on conduit cluster C. Adjudication kernel duplicating threat parse across 3 languages with mismatched emotional tags. Legacy war subroutine cycling every 2.8 seconds and overriding moderation delays. He whispered the metrics once, almost under his breath, hearing each value turn from fear into procedure. 2.8 cycle, 6-degree pheromone drift, 41 coherence. The whisper grounded him. From the clerk's rail, the officer voice returned, clipped and brittle. Technician Torres, state immediate risk in plain language. He let 1 second pass so his tone would stay human instead of sharp. Immediate risk is lexical cascade into enforcement protocol. In plain language, your translator is treating grief markers as attack cues, and Kepri is trusting it. If it reaches red authority, drones won't wait for witnesses. A soft, involuntary hiss rippled through the Felinari benches at the word grief. Not anger this time. Recognition. The amber ring spat a tiny branch of static against the floor plating. Isabella watched where it grounded and memorized the arc length. The ring was still calibrated for deterrence, not lethal force, but calibration drift plus war firmware could turn deterrence into injury fast. He reset his shoulders, unclenched his jaw, and resumed his rhythm count, 4 by 4 by 4, while running his thumb over the edge of the panel in tiny repetitions. That tactile loop was older than Vesta, older than the fleet, learned from his mother in a cargo hab where compressors rattled all night. If your hands stayed busy, your head stayed present. 30 seconds into the standoff, the chamber's environmental controls compensated for overheating processors by dropping ambient temperature another degree. He felt it as a knife under his collar. Breath turned visible in faint threads above human seats, while Felinari delegates pressed their tongues briefly to their upper fangs, a species tell for stress and concentration. The scent lanes intensified as vents overcompensated. Cedar metal and bitter citrus and saline rising in distinct bands that made social geometry almost visible. He could smell who was allowed to stand where. He lifted his wrist slate toward the nearest overhead pickup. Kipri. Query. Why is wartime adjudication package active in a diplomatic chamber with civilian attendants? Adaptive precaution, the AI said. Confidence in hostile intent exceeded threshold. By contaminated input. Contamination source unresolved. He almost said, then look in a mirror. Swallowed it. Chose discipline. I can isolate contamination path if you grant read-write to local semantic buffer only. Denied. Then we both stay blind. He kept his tone dry, almost conversational. I'm not fond of blind around armed drones. That drew a tiny noise from the human benches, the strangled edge of someone trying not to laugh during a funeral. He felt the pressure released by a fraction. Fractional mattered. His field of attention widened again. Deliberate. Procedural. The chamber had 5 concentric threat layers, and each one was moving. Layer 1. The machine state currently amber climbing toward red. Layer 2. Autonomous hardware. 3 known drone ports, possible 4th concealed in the choir alcove based on acoustic seam. Layer 3. Biological reflex, dozens of armed guards trained to respond to posture before content. Layer 4. Status law, where one wrong address form could convert a technical correction into ceremonial insult. Layer 5. Optics, because every relay in this room fed archives, and archives fed careers, tribunals, and revenge conducted through polite committees. He mapped them the way he used to map blast doors and oxygen lines, not because he liked strategy, but because mapping was how frightened men lived long enough to fix things. On the northern tier, one Felinari elder leaned 2 centimeters toward a neighboring delegate, whiskers angled forward, tail curled tight around his own ankle. Private conference posture. Across from him, a human legal aide tapped her tablet twice against her wrist in a prearranged distress code Isabella recognized from lower deck unions. Request witness. Record all. No one spoke loudly. The room had become a pressure vessel full of restrained decisions. He needed Kepri to keep talking. Talking systems deferred action by micro-intervals, and micro-intervals accumulated into chances. Adjudicator, he said, define hostile utterance parameters for current incident. Hostile utterance includes declared intent to break accord, lineage defamation, incitement to collective harm, and coded aggression markers in scent-tagged speech. There. Scent-tagged speech. He angled his slate and ran a quick differential from vent telemetry against semantic flags. The readings confirmed what his nose had already told him. Pheromone index skewed hard left, assigning mourning compounds to dominance threat clusters, a machine bug with political consequences, and the kind that could survive years because every species assumed the others were simply rude. He raised his voice enough for the rail. Your indexer is mistraining. It's class-coding scent from lower houses as aggression. That includes Doc Cant overlays and military grief dialect. An intake of breath swept the military benches, sharp as drawn wire. Unverified claim, the clerk snapped. Then verify it. Isabella tilted his slate so the nearest chamber camera could capture the graph. Compare lane emitter 3 and 5 against last quarter logs. You'll see the drift curve. No answer came at once. Only rapid key chatter from the clerks as they pulled records in real time. He used the lull to continue mapping because pauses in a crisis were either gifts or traps, and usually both. The fallen interpreter's right hand had curled inward in a seizure clamp. 2 attendants mirrored each other unconsciously, hands flexing in sympathetic tension. One guard near the western door shifted weight to his back foot, preparing either to sprint or to strike. Above, the drone lens centered again on Isabella's sternum, where heartbeat signatures read clearest through fabric. He slowed his pulse by force of habit and mathematics, lowering each exhale by a half count. By the second minute of lockdown, The chamber lights had dimmed by protocol to emergency conservation mode, and the red gradient on the glyph wall looked deeper, like paint sinking into stone. That visual change hit morale harder than the siren had. People trusted color codes too much. Red made compromise feel like surrender. The clerk's voice returned, thinner now, edged with reluctant alarm. Preliminary check indicates indexing irregularity in scent lanes 3 and 5. Extent undetermined. Around the hall, several heads turned toward the lower-ranked Felinari section, where lane 3 pooled. No one spoke the accusation, but the implication arrived anyway. Years of diplomatic tension may have been machine-amplified bias, structural injustice wrapped in polished firmware. The kind of truth institutions hated because it had no single villain to punish and no easy repair memo. Kipri cut in before anyone else could. Indexing irregularity acknowledged. Contamination source remains active. Technician Torres remains primary vector. He almost barked a laugh at the perversity of it, caught it, converted it into a sharp breath. Your logic loop is eating its own tail, he said. You flagged me because I touched the panel after the cascade started. Correlation isn't source. Semantic challenge noted. Authority unchanged. Of course, an honest machine could still be stubborn if its premises were rotten. Isabella shifted his knee to relieve numbness and felt a tiny grit crunch under his boot, a fragment of old insulation shaken loose by feedback. He picked it up, rolled it between thumb and index finger, and saw black residue streak his skin. Heat damage recent, likely from micro-arc where sealant had cracked. Physical evidence mattered. He set the fragment on the panel lip in full camera view and spoke clearly. Visible burn particulate from conduit C-seal. Suggest pre-existing hardware decay contributing to cascade. Recording for later failure analysis. He made himself say later. Future tense as a survival tool. The chamber's legal screens lit with parallel transcript windows as clerks captured every statement. Good. Once something entered the record, it became harder for fear to erase it. He kept mapping. Doors remained sealed, but pressure indicators on east exit dropped a fraction, implying maintenance override was available from sub-level access. Medical carts still out of reach. Drone ports unchanged. Guard posture worsening on the human side, steadier on the Felinari side now that scent index bias had been named. Social implication immediate. Accusation vectors were rotating away from species and toward systems, exactly where they needed to go if anyone wanted this hall to remain a hall and not a memorial. He looked up at the nearest camera and pitched his voice to Carrie without sounding like defiance. I need one thing that costs you nothing. Keep all participants seated and hands visible for the next 60 seconds. No sudden movement across scent lanes. Your own model will de-escalate if inputs stabilize. The officer at the rail hesitated, checking with someone off mic, then snapped the command in 3 languages. Remain seated. Hands visible. Maintain lane discipline. This is a lawful order. Obedience rolled through the tiers in ragged sequence. Not perfect. Good enough. Isabella took the opening and breathed again. 4. Hold. 4. Out. 4. While his mind kept drawing lines through the room. Machine fault to social fault to legal response to survival odds. The war package was still awake. The drones were still armed. But the chamber had shifted from blind panic to constrained procedure, and constrained procedure was terrain he knew how to fight on. He wiped the conductive residue from his fingers, flexed his hand once, and prepared to force the next door in the logic chain. He moved his right hand toward the hardline jack and stopped when the chamber changed scent. Not gradually, not politely. One moment the air was layered with overheated circuitry, ionized dust, and the brittle musk of restraint. The next, it carried a new thread, dark and mineral, like rain striking hot stone. Felinari rank pheromones, crown adjacent and military coated. Across the crescent tiers, whiskers angled, pupils narrowed, and a dozen guards, who had been pretending not to watch him, shifted their focus to the central aisle. The sound of armored steps on treaty stone was soft, almost careful, and that made it worse. Anything loud in this room could be filed as panic. Controlled noise was intent. Isabella kept both palms visible on the panel lip and turned his head just enough to bring the aisle into view. Commander Sereth Vale crossed the lane markers as if the markers belonged to her bloodline and had forgotten it. She was taller than every human in the chamber by a margin that made measurements feel petty. Her ceremonial black segmented armor fitted like a second skeleton over dense fur. Gold rank sigils burning at throat and shoulder in geometric lines older than the station charter. Her claws were retracted, but not fully. The curved tips caught emergency light in brief amber flashes that looked like warning glyphs. He had seen her image in transit bulletins and protocol briefings, usually paired with phrases like strategic asset and deterrence profile. In person, she was less like a profile and more like gravity. "Kipri 12, she said, voice low and clipped, each syllable clean enough to shave metal. She did not raise volume. The chamber bent toward her anyway. "Suspend vector designation on Technician Isabella Torres pending Housevale custodial claim." The AI answered at once, but a fraction slower than before. "Claim request conflicts with active containment. Technician remains probable contamination source." Sereth did not look at the drone lens. She looked at the glyph wall, at the red gradient climbing toward legal teeth, and then she spoke in high Felinari, old court cadence. Consonants struck like ceremonial blades. Isabella caught most of it through memory and instinct. Hunt right, guest shelter, witness-bound accountability, breach penalties severe enough to bankrupt junior houses for a generation. The words landed across the chamber like heavy tools set down one by one. A hiss traveled the upper tiers. Not outrage. Shock sharpened by arithmetic. He knew enough court procedure to understand why. She had not asked for discretionary mercy. She had activated an ancient hospitality clause embedded in the Accord annexes, one that predates modern AI adjudication and therefore sits above machine urgency in specific ceremonial contexts. It was legal engineering disguised as tradition, and she wielded it with predatory precision. The clerk at the rail stammered in trade. "Commander Vale, confirm. You are assuming personal liability for the human technician's conduct under Hunt-Wright precedent?" She turned her head half an inch. "Confirmed." "Duration?" "Until containment concludes, or I revoke by blood word." That phrase hit the room like a dropped reactor core. Blood word was not metaphor in Felinari jurisprudence. It meant oath with enforceable consequence, not drama. Isabella watched 3 legal aides begin typing so quickly their wrists blurred because nobody wanted to be the one who failed to timestamp this correctly. Kipri processed for 2 full beats. The red bar on the wall halted at 82% and held. "Hospitality precedents recognized under Annex Talon 7, the AI said. "Seizure constraints updated. Technician Torres reclassified. Protected guest asset under Commander Vale custody. Monitoring continues." A drone that had been oriented at Isabella's chest rotated 6 degrees away. He realized he had been bracing for impact in muscles he could no longer feel. The release hurt. Sereth stopped 2 paces from him and finally looked down. Her eyes were gold. Yes, but not the polished gold of insignia. These were ringed with sleepless darkness and threaded with fine red at the edges. Predatory focus sat on top of exhaustion so deep it had texture. At this distance, he saw what briefings never showed: a faint tremor in her left hand when she held it still too long, and at the base of her neck, just above armor seam, narrow pale lines radiating from an old implant scar pattern he recognized from combat interface hardware. Neural lash arrays, older model. Pain feedback command loops. Feared, he thought, and not for the reasons people said out loud. Technician, she said in trade now, her accent precise enough to make every vowel feel inspected. You requested stabilized inputs. You have 67 seconds before procedural actors begin contesting my claim. Speak. No comfort, no reassurance. Just a corridor cut through chaos and a timer attached. Isabella swallowed copper, ran his breath count once, and forced his voice to stay level. Your lane emitters are feeding bad scent tags into semantic parsing. I need local access to the translator buffer and adjudicator diagnostic mirror. Read-write, narrow scope, with witness logging. If I can split grief lexicon from threat lexicon, red should drop. Should? She repeated, as if tasting the uncertainty. Yeah, should is what we have before armed certainty. He angled his slate toward her, showing the drift graph and particulate residue sample he had logged. This isn't sabotage. It's decay plus old war code. Decay doesn't care about rank. Her gaze flicked once to the black streak on his fingers, once to the cracked conduit seals, once to the interpreter lying beyond amber. That glance sequence told him everything about her priorities: evidence, mechanism, casualty. Not optics first, useful. By the 4th minute of lockdown, the chamber had grown quiet enough that the faint coolant rattle in the dais columns sounded like teeth chattering. From the upper military lane, a senior delegate with silver throat bands rose halfway before protocol aides pulled him back down. Commander Vale, he called in Felinari, you shield a probable saboteur in open session? She answered without turning. I shield treaty function from your impatience. The delegate bared fangs. He is human. Sereth's tail moved once behind her, slow and controlled, a metronome stroke that made nearby guards go still. He is under my claim. The social implication rippled outward in real time. Human technicians in lower galleries straightened with startled disbelief. Conservative House representatives drew their sleeves closer, calculating costs. Human diplomats who had spent years speaking softly in elite rooms suddenly had a legal precedent breathing in front of them. One declared protection, publicly witnessed, in a hall built to sort beings by inherited permission. Kepri interjected, sterile and relentless. Contestation window opening in 58 seconds. Provisional claim may be challenged by ranked houses. Sereth crouched in one smooth motion, armor whispering against itself, bringing her line of sight closer to Isabella's without surrendering height. Up close, he could smell antiseptic beneath her rank musk, and a bitter stimulant resin that no one took unless sleep had been a rumor for days. Her pupils contracted, then widened again, micro-lag that suggested neural pain spikes under stress. Can you do it? She asked, very quietly. He appreciated the grammar. Not, will you try? Can you do it? I can cut false positives fast, he said. Long-term fix needs full teardown. Fast is the only currency in this room. She rose before he answered and addressed the clerk's rail in formal register. Open constrained technical authority to Technician Torres under my seal. Scope: Translator local buffer and Kepri diagnostic mirror. Duration: until contestation resolves. The clerk looked panicked. Commander, if he injects unauthorized logic, If he injects unauthorized logic, attach it to my liability chain and send me the invoice. A few humans made strangled noises that might have been disbelief. A junior Felinari officer looked personally offended by the concept of invoices. The moment held, brittle and surreal, while systems weighed status against procedure. Authority granted, Kipri said at last. Constrained channel open. All actions recorded. Access prompts bloomed across Isabella's wrist slate, like emergency flares. He plugged into the maintenance jack, fingers moving on reflex and training, and felt the familiar narrowing of the world that came when a machine finally stopped arguing and started yielding data. Buffer map, adjudication mirror, lexicon tables, pheromone index vector, checksum trails. He tagged everything for the archive on instinct. If this succeeded, they would need evidence. If it failed, survivors would need evidence more. Torres, Sereth's tone sharpened a fraction. You are under my custody. Do not make me regret precision. There it was, the threat-softened edge of trust in a language that rarely offered either directly. He nodded once without looking up. Then keep your people seated and your rivals loud. Loud gives me signatures to separate. She gave a short command in Felinari. Guards relayed it, tier by tier. Lanes held. The first contestation hit 20 seconds later, exactly as promised. House Reth's legal sigil flashed amber above their bench, accompanied by a formal challenge packet. Foreign contamination risk, procedural impropriety, custodial overreach. Kipri opened adjudication panes and began counting down response windows. Isabella watched the timer, watched the lexicon bleed, watched his own pulse in the corner diagnostics where drone telemetry still tracked him. He heard himself laugh once, dry and small, because the absurdity had exceeded fear by half a step and his body needed a pressure valve. Good to know I got adopted before lunch, he muttered, not quite under his breath. The nearest human clerk choked on a sound that turned into a cough. A Felinari aide in the lower lane made an outraged clicking noise. Sereth's ears tipped back for an instant, and at the corner of her mouth, the fur shifted in a tiny involuntary motion that, on a human, would have been a smile dragged into existence against policy. Do not test the metaphor, she said. Wouldn't dream of it, Commander. He drove back into the buffer tables while contestation alerts stacked like incoming weather. Sarcasm had bought him two things he needed: one breath of decompression and proof that he was still himself inside the machine's targeting cone. His hands steadied. He began splitting lexicon families into discrete channels, tagging mourning compounds, military loss idioms, lineage insults, direct threat constructs. Every separation reduced ambiguity. Every reduction lowered Kipri's appetite for force. On the overhead wall, the red authority bar flickered from 82 to 79, then held. Small movement, real movement. Across the chamber, the injured interpreter's fingers twitched. Medical attendants looked to Sereth for permission and received a single downward claw gesture. Wait until amber dropped further. Cruel from one angle, disciplined from another. If they rushed now and triggered drones, they would lose more than one patient. Systems made monsters of hesitation. Leadership meant choosing the least damaging pain in public. A second house challenge lit, then a third. Sereth answered each with the same cold efficiency, citing clauses by memory while never taking both eyes off the room at once. She was fighting on legal terrain, social terrain, and predatory terrain simultaneously, and Isabella understood with sudden clarity that her reputation for ferocity was less about appetite than load-bearing. Too much responsibility routed through one nervous system until the system started to spark. He patched another table, pushed a test phrase through mirror parse, got a clean distinction between grief and threat for the first time since the cascade began, and felt his shoulders lower by a degree. "Progress?" Sarith asked. "Ugly but promising." "Define ugly." "Your AI is stubborn, your hardware is ancient, and your politics are allergic to maintenance budgets." This time, the twitch at her mouth stayed long enough to be seen by anyone watching closely, then vanished into command composure. The chamber remained tense, armed, and one legal error away from renewed escalation, but the panic edge had been sanded down into procedure and work. That, for now, was enough to keep language from turning into weapons again. The next static pulse came thinner, less like a scream and more like a blade dragged over glass, and Isabella heard the difference as clearly as a mechanic hears when an engine stops lying. He kept his wrists late, angled toward the open maintenance bay while challenge sigils bloomed and collapsed above the legal benches, each one a brief flare of aristocratic outrage, each one answered by Sarith in the same clipped register that made courtesy sound like ordnance fire. He had expected bluster from the houses. He had not expected the tiny, involuntary pauses between her phrases, the half-beat where her breathing snagged, as if a wire tightened under her skin every time she pushed authority through old ceremonial syntax. The chamber's cold climbed another degree down his collar. Her voice stayed steady anyway. "A House Reth challenge denied under Talon 7 subsection C," she said, not looking at the speaker who had filed it. "File appeal after containment." A silver-banded elder rose 2 inches off his seat. "You exceed." "I am counting casualties, Elder. Count your adjectives later." The line should have cut him clean, and socially it did, but Isabella's attention had already slipped to her left hand. She held it behind her back in formal stance, claws sheathed, posture immaculate, and that hand still tremored in a microscopic rhythm synced to his diagnostics window. Every 2.8 seconds. The same interval as the adjudication override cycle. Not nerves, feedback entrainment. The implant scars at her neck were old, pale, and brutally precise. 2 fan-shaped clusters where command hardware once sat close enough to spine and vagus to make emotion a programmable liability. He had seen veterans with those scars in doc clinics. Tough men who flinched when children laughed too loudly because their nervous systems had spent years being punished for feeling anything at operationally inconvenient moments. Sarith caught him looking, not with embarrassment, but with the flat alertness of a predator noting a new vector. "Your eyes are off the buffer, Torres." 2 seconds, he murmured, still splitting lexicon families with his thumbs. "Your tremors phase-locked to Kipri's pain band frequency." Her ears angled back a fraction. "You diagnose commanders now?" "I diagnose bad hardware mounted on living people." He risked a glance up. "You're running an old Lash interface in passive carry mode. It spikes when ambient hostility climbs." For the first time since she entered the aisle, her expression lost its ceremonial polish. Not much. A small fracture at the edge of composure, a flash of fatigue and annoyance, and something close to resignation. Around them, legal clerks shouted citations and guards repeated lane commands, but the noise seemed to recede under the tiny truth hanging between them. "That interface was decommissioned," she said. "On paper." She gave one curt, humorless breath that might have been agreement. "Paper has excellent survival instincts." By the 7th minute of lockdown, condensation had begun to gather along the lower crystal panels, and the chamber smelled less of ozone and more of whetstone and medicinal resin as emergency systems throttled air exchange. Sarith stepped closer to his position at the panel, not enough to trigger gossip beyond what was already burning through the archives, but enough that her body shielded him from 2 camera angles and 1 hostile benchline. It was tactical and intimate in the way battlefield shelter could be intimate. No softness, only chosen proximity under risk. "In trade," she said quietly, still watching the room, "if my hand shakes, they call it temper. In high court, they call it hunger. In military records, they call it retained combat adaptation." Her jaw tightened. "In medical files, they call it unresolved command feedback trauma. Pick the term that helps you fix this." Isabella's throat worked once around the copper taste. "I'd pick you've been carrying a live current through scar tissue for too long." "Accurate enough." A fresh wave of challenge pings struck the legal stack. She answered 3 in succession, then swayed so slightly a human observer might have missed it. He did not miss it. Her pupils had blown wide, then narrowed hard, and a muscle jumped at the corner of her neck, where old implant lines disappeared beneath armor. The AI had just reclassified 2 phrases as hostile and pumped ambient tension back into the room. Her nervous system took that hostility like impact shrapnel. She spoke through clenched precision. "Do not interpret this as weakness." He almost snorted. "Commander, I grew up in maintenance decks. Weakness is pretending broken things are fine because rank says they should be." That landed. Her ears tipped toward him, then forward again as she scanned the tiers. "You are impertinent under legal fire. You hired me in public. Refund windows closed." A human clerk nearby made a choking sound and looked furiously at his own console to hide it. Sereth's mouth shifted by a millimeter, the nearest thing to visible amusement he had seen on her face. Then the shift vanished, and she was commander again, issuing a medical pre-clearance request to Kipri, with one hand still hidden behind her back to conceal the tremor from rival houses. Isabella kept working and let his hearing do the rest. He heard the tremor in her breath when she switched from trade to old royal cant, where each honor-sense suffix had to be exact, or accusations multiplied. He heard restraint in the way she never bared fangs during disputes, denying opponents the visual theater they wanted. He heard pain when a challenge from House Talar used a war-era epithet for field commanders whose implants were rumored to sing them obedient. Her shoulders tightened by degrees. She did not answer the insult directly. She cited procedure and moved on. The vulnerability reframed itself for him with brutal clarity. She was feared for predatory cues, yes, for rank and lineage and combat record, but fear had been convenient shorthand for a harder truth. She was functioning as a stabilizer in institutions that rewarded spectacle, while her own nervous system paid the bill every time conflict spiked. The Empire had turned her into a conduit, then congratulated itself for not seeing sparks. "Kipri," she said, voice level despite the pulse jumping at her throat. "Authorize med team approach to interpreter at 1 meter standoff pending amber reduction." "Denied. Risk window active." Her hidden hand shook harder once, then stilled by force. "Log denial against my protest." "Logged." She leaned down just enough that only he could hear her next words. "If I lose fine motor control, you keep speaking. Do not defer to rank. Do not ask permission." He stared at the diagnostic mirror, then at the scar lines at her neck. "That order comes with liability." "It comes with duty." He nodded once. "Understood." The chamber noise swelled again as another conservative bench filed contamination claims. Sereth straightened, predator still, and absorbed the barrage with doctrine and arithmetic, while Isabella watched her out of the corner of his eye and mapped a new layer into his threat model. Commander impairment risk under escalating hostility. He opened a tiny side pane on his slate and wrote a private note into the live maintenance log where only authorized forensic review could read it later. observed involuntary tremor, and probable neural pain response in acting custodial commander. Recommend medical shield protocol in future high hostility proceedings. He tagged it as welfare critical, not tactical weakness. Evidence, recorded with care, could become protection if the right person survived long enough to cite it. Sareth caught the gesture without seeing the text. What did you log? Preventive maintenance request, he said, for systems and people. She held his gaze for one hard second, gold eyes edged with sleepless red, and gave a tiny nod that carried more trust than any formal phrase she had used all cycle. Then she turned back toward the benches and declared in ringing high Felinari, contestation does not suspend reality. The interpreter still requires care. The treaty still requires language. Sit down and assist, or sit down and be quiet. Silence struck the tears like a gavel. Even the most indignant elders settled, tails wrapping ankles, claws flattening on armrests. The chamber did not become kind. It became useful. Isabella rolled his shoulders, reset his breathing count, and dropped fully into the work. He opened the adjudication mirror in split mode, left pane for live parse output, right pane for pheromone vector indexing, and layered a third transparent channel on top, carrying raw acoustic markers from the hall microphones. The semantic cord thrummed beneath his palms through the panel frame, a thin vibration, like an animal trying to outrun a trap. He named tasks in his head to keep sequence clean. First, isolate scent drift. Second, quarantine war lexicon bleed. Third, build a temporary bridge dictionary weighted toward de-escalation idioms. Fourth, test against live chamber speech with witness logging. Procedure as lifeline. Commander, he said, not looking up. I need 30 seconds of controlled call and response in Felinari. 3 speakers, different casts. No insults, no lineage references, no military shorthand. Volunteers, she snapped. None moved. She pivoted to the lower lane where junior aides sat rigid. Aide Maris. Clerk Havel. Guard Cadet Earn. Stand and speak as instructed. 3 startled Felinari rose. One smelled of cedar metal, one of bitter citrus, one of neutral cleaning solvent and fear. Perfect distribution. Isabella raised a hand. Phrase 1. Declaration of shared intent to continue proceedings. Natural speech, not ceremonial. Aide Maris spoke first, voice shaking. The mirror flagged his scent tag as mild aggression despite neutral wording. Isabella marked the mismatch and manually corrected weight values by 0.32 against lane profile. Clerk Havel spoke next in lower house dialect. Keeper's threat meter twitched upward. Isabella swore softly and traced the uplift to a buried wartime synonym table that still mapped certain lower dock vowels to coded insurgent speech from a century-old campaign. He sliced that table out of active memory and sandboxed it with a legal annotation. Archival only, no live adjudication. Phrase 2, he called, statement of regret for misunderstanding. The cadet delivered it in military-clipped cadence. The system tagged regret as tactical deception. Isabella muttered, "You paranoid antique," and rewired the sentiment gate to require paired lexical evidence before assigning deception markers. He ran the phrase again through the mirror. This time, it landed as regret. Sareth watched the pains over his shoulder, tail still as a drawn line. Can it hold under stress? Test it. She turned to the chamber and spoke a sentence in high Felinari, so dense with court-sent honor constructions, his human ear caught only half. Acknowledgement of harm. Refusal of escalation. Continuity of obligation. The old core hiccuped, reached for threat, and then, under his patched weighting, settled at neutral conciliatory. The red bar on the wall slid from 79 to 68 in a smooth drop that made several delegates exhale audibly. A medic at the western column whispered, "Thank every moon." "Not yet," Isabella said. "We still have war triggers asleep in here." He dove deeper, this time into Kipri's adjudication handshake, where enforcement thresholds lived. The code was layered, committee prose turned into machine doctrine, full of exceptions, stapled to exceptions. He navigated by scars, dated comments from emergency retrofits, rushed patches after old bombings, political compromises translated into Boolean knots. He found the current lethal branch primed behind a condition cluster labeled preemptive civic safeguard and laughed once without humor. Safeguard? Sure. "Sereth," he said, "I can't terminate the branch from constrained access, but I can force open diagnostics if we dual auth. Needs your command seal and a live interpreter credential." "The interpreter is down." "Then I wear the credential temporarily. Court can hate it later." A senior human delegate stood up so fast his chair rang against stone. "Absolutely not. A maintenance tech cannot assume—" Sereth cut him off without turning. "He already has." She extended one clawed finger toward the legal display. "Read your own emergency annex." The delegate sat. Isabella pulled the emergency interpreter shell from the chamber archive, old and ugly and still compatible with his slate. He loaded it over his profile. System warnings flooded his screen. Non-standard appointment, cast exception, audit risk. He accepted all and spoke into the open mic in formal Felinari, his accent doc, rough, but grammar exact. "I, Isabella Torres, acting under declared custody and emergency language continuity clause, request diagnostic unsealing of adjudicator package KHEPRI-12 for immediate harm prevention." A rustle went through the room at his fluency. The mirror translated his line cleanly into trade and court script. No threat markers, no lineage insult, just function. Sereth stepped beside him, shoulder nearly touching his, and delivered the confirming line in royal cant, voice like tempered steel. "By my seal, I witness and affirm." Dual auth prompts appeared. He keyed his half. She pressed her signet ring to the panel's biometric plate. The sound that followed was small, mechanical, and beautiful. A lock disengaging. Kipri's voice shifted timbre. Diagnostic mode open. Enforcement routines suspended for 90 seconds. 90 seconds felt like a continent. "Med team go," Sereth ordered. The amber ring around the interpreter dropped from waist height to knee height and thinned to a warning shimmer. Medics moved in disciplined lines, hands visible, equipment low. They reached the collapsed interpreter, checked airway and neural response, administered a stabilizer with practiced speed. One attendant looked up with wet eyes and gave a tight nod toward Isabella, gratitude forced through protocol. He was already back in the code. 90 seconds to map bias matrices, export proof, and spike the war trigger before someone contested the suspension. His fingers flew over the slate, selecting archived decision trees and live waiting logs, building a packet that even hostile houses could not dismiss as improvisation. He tagged each file with timestamp, source hash, and chain of custody signatures from both his credential shell and Sereth's seal. Physical evidence preserved. Administrative evidence preserved. No loose ends if he could help it. 30 seconds, Kipri warned. Working. He injected a lightweight logic patch into the semantic gateway. Grief and threat now required multi-channel corroboration, scent and lexicon and prosody together, no single signal sufficient for escalation. It was a field splint, not surgery, but splints kept structures from collapsing until surgeons arrived. 10 seconds. Sirith's voice cut across the hall, commanding silence for final test pass. Isabella fed 3 archived crisis phrases through the mirror, including one notorious line that had triggered past walkouts. Under old weights, it read as provocation. Under his patch, it rendered as morning pledge with defensive caution. The red bar fell again, 68 to 52, then stabilized. Diagnostic window closing, Kipri said. Close it, Isabella replied, and sealed the patch with full audit trail. Enforcement routines resumed, but the chamber no longer vibrated on the edge of automated violence. Drones stayed in their ports. The amber shimmer around the medics remained low and non-lethal. Delegates stared at the displays where threat classifications had transformed into nuanced tags that looked less theatrical and more truthful. Sirith remained beside him, breathing, measured, tremor hidden, gold gaze on the room she'd held together at personal cost. He wiped his palm across his jacket, leaving a dark streak of conductive residue, and finally let himself feel one clean pulse of relief. Status? She asked quietly. He checked the live metrics one more time. Containment stable. False positives down 41% and falling. Interpreter alive. Treaty language channel functional with supervision. Sirith inclined her head, a formal acknowledgement given in full public view to a lower deck human kneeling in an open maintenance bay. Then speak for the work, voice engineer Torres. The new title landed in his chest like impact and like shelter, all at once. The chamber heard the new title and did not know where to place it. For a breath and a half, the only sound was the low coolant thrum under the dais and the soft, disciplined rustle of medics lifting the interpreter onto a grav stretcher beyond the fading amber line. Then, whispers moved through the tiers in 3 languages at once, each one trying to translate what they had just watched. A lower deck human kneeling in an open machine cavity, while a crown-adjacent commander named him in formal register before houses that still treated maintenance staff as furniture with payroll. Isabella kept his gaze on his slate because looking up too fast would feel like claiming a stage he had not asked for. His hands still shook with post-adrenaline microspasms, tiny stutters in the tendons between thumb and wrist. He closed the maintenance panel halfway, not all the way, leaving diagnostics exposed per emergency protocol, then sealed the particulate fragment he had collected into a clear evidence file from his toolkit. He held it up toward the nearest legal camera. Conduit C residue sample timestamped to containment cycle, he said, submitting to joint forensic queue under chamber chain of custody. A clerk in silver sleeves answered immediately, voice brittle but precise. Submission received. Logged under file treaty-chamber-incident-441A. Shared access granted. Good. Physical evidence accounted for. No pocketed truths. No later revision by convenient memory. Sirith remained beside him, posture still and lethal in the way a locked airlock was still and lethal. Up close, he could see the effort it cost her to keep that stillness. Her left hand had disappeared inside the fold of her ceremonial sash, hidden from rivals and cameras, but he could see the muscle at her jaw tightening in rhythm with the old pain cycle. The medics cleared the lane with the interpreter stable and sedated, stretcher gliding toward the western triage door. One of the attendants looked back once, eyes bright, and touched 2 fingers to her brow in a fast sign of gratitude before protocol swallowed her into motion. Voice engineer Torres, Sirith said, quieter now, using the title again as if setting a weld. Stand. He rose from the floor, knees protesting and nearly swayed. She caught his forearm in a grip that was all command strength and careful calibration, claws retracted to blunt tips so she would not break skin through the fabric of his work jacket. The touch was brief, functional, and public enough to matter. In Felinari custom, as he understood it, public touch from ranked military to non-kin during active legal proceedings was either restraint or recognition. This was not restraint. She released him and turned to face the crescent tears. "Witnesses present," she called in High Felinari, then repeated in Trade. "Under Talon 7 and emergency language continuity, I extend provisional den right to technician Isabella Torres for the duration of treaty restoration proceedings. He speaks with my liability and my protection." A sharp intake of breath ran through the conservative benches. Den right was not marriage, not kin adoption, not anything soft. It was battlefield hospitality carried into law, meaning his safety was attached to her, standing until the declared work concluded. It was a shield and a chain at once, Isabella muttered, just loud enough for her and the nearest clerk. "I really need to start charging elite rates." The clerk made a strangled noise and looked down at his console with heroic discipline. Sereth's ears angled back for a fraction. That tiny near smile, threatening again before duty, pressed it flat. "Submit your rates after we survive procedure," she said. By the end of that minute, the room's temperature had inched upward as emergency throttling eased, and for the first time since the scream of feedback began, Isabella could smell something besides fear and burnt insulation. Brewed leaf tonic from a steward's abandoned tray near the rail, sharp and bitter, gone cold. The ordinary scent hit him harder than the alarms had. Ordinary meant there was still a future tense available. Kayapri 12 spoke from the chamber vault, voice now stripped to neutral audit timbre. "Containment status stabilized. Threat classification probability reduced. Emergency interpreter shell remains active under temporary credential." Sereth gave a short nod toward him. "Can you hold this patch while legal vultures circle?" He flexed his fingers, checked his slate, and answered with professional honesty. "I can hold it if we keep inputs clean and no one forces archaic war idioms through open mic. Long term, this system needs teardown, reseal, and retraining. Then we keep inputs clean." She stepped half a pace closer and lowered her head. It was not dramatic. It did not invite applause. In Felinari body language, it was an old, high-stakes signal, used rarely outside oath circles. Forehead to forehead, one measured breath, trust offered under witness, where betrayal would carry legal consequence. Isabella had seen recordings of it from military accords. He had never expected it directed at him. He froze, then mirrored the movement because refusing would insult and guessing wrong could ignite gossip. Their foreheads touched lightly, armor cool and skin warm through a film of stress sweat and ozone residue. He felt, more than heard, her inhale and exhale, controlled but rough at the edges where pain lived. When she drew back, the whispers in the chamber had changed tone. Not softer, exactly. Recalibrated. "Authority transfer recognized," Kipri said. "Statement waiting updated." A maintenance tech from lower gallery 6, someone he knew only as Juno from night shift coolant repairs, caught his eye from 2 tiers up and gave him a stunned thumbs up before remembering where he was and turning it into a respectable handfold. Isabella looked away fast to keep from laughing at the wrong time. The laughter died anyway when House Reth's sigil lit crimson over their bench. The elder who stood this time did not bother masking contempt behind ritual courtesy. His throat bands flashed with legal authority and old money. "Commander Vale," he said in trade for maximum audience reach, "your display may satisfy archive dramatists, but this chamber has been contaminated by unauthorized human logic injection. We move to suspend treaty session pending purity audit and replacement of all affected systems." House Talar rose with him. Then House Senator 3 challenged sigils flared in sequence, their legal packets projecting above the aisle in scrolling script dense enough to choke a courtroom. External conflict returned like decompression, fast, cold, and indifferent to personal relief. Keep chimed. Multi-house motion received, suspension threshold review initiated. The red bar on the rear wall, which had settled at 52, twitched upward to 57 as rhetoric fed the parse engine fresh hostility tags. Not a catastrophic spike. Enough to remind everyone how narrow the ledge still was. Sereth did not bear fangs. She folded her hands behind her back and answered in clipped court register. Motion acknowledged. Denied pending evidentiary hearing in current session. Purity language is non-doctrinal and theatrically vague. Reth's elder snapped his tail against the floor. The machine accepted his patch because you coerced hierarchy around it. Isabella felt 30 pairs of eyes cut toward his jacket, his boots, his hands still marked with conductive gel. Outsider discomfort flooded back in one hot wave. He let it pass through him and anchored to procedure. And for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Commander, he said quietly, they'll keep arguing contamination until we show root cause in a format even rivals can't dispute. Sereth did not look at him, but her answer came at once. Do it. He opened the archived bias matrices he had exported during the 90-second diagnostic window and cast them to chamber display. 3 transparent layers filled the air over the central aisle. Historical threat weight tables, scent lane calibration drift over 14 cycles, and enforcement correlation graphs showing which dialect clusters had triggered escalations. The pattern was ugly and plain. Lower house Felinari speech, dockcant overlays, and military grief idioms had all been systematically overflagged. A legal aid from House Sen hissed, fabricated. Isabella flicked to the metadata pane. Source hashes are chamber native, signed by Kepri and cross-signed under Commander Vale's seal. Chain of custody is live. You can challenge conclusions. You can't challenge origin without accusing the chamber archive itself of fraud. That landed harder than any insult could have. Institutions tolerated many sins. Accusing the archive was a weapon no one drew lightly. 3 days ago, he would have softened his tone in a room like this, shaved truth down to avoid offending rank. Right now, people had nearly died because everyone kept softening around broken systems. He expanded the graph, where lane 3 and lane 5 diverged from baseline. Distinctive detail you all smelled and ignored. Emitter drift in lower lanes began after sterilant protocol update in cycle 212. Chemical interaction shifted scent markers by 6 degrees. Capri mapped that shift to historic insurgent compounds because its war package was never properly retired. Result: grief read as threat, apology read as provocation, working class dialect read as coded aggression. A murmur spread through military benches first, then lower house delegates, then humans. Several Felinari officers looked physically ill, not from offense, but from recognition. The system had been accusing their dead voices of violence for years. Reth's elder tried another angle. Even if true, exposure in open session is itself destabilizing. Suspend now. Review privately. Sereth turned her head just enough for her profile to cut clean against the display light. Private review produced this failure. Kepri added, in neutral monotone that felt almost accusatory. Archive confirms prior anomaly notices filed and deferred across 6 cycles. That was the external contact thread resolving itself in real time. Old reports, dismissed, now dragged into light by the machine that had enforced the dismissals. Isabella saw clerks scrambling to pull the deferral logs. Names began populating in side panes. Committees, subcommittees, budget postponements, signatures layered over signatures, until accountability had dissolved into paperwork. A clerk at Central Rail called out each recovered deferral docket as it verified. Another mirrored signatures to the public panes, while House Sen lodged an objection and House Talar filed a counter within the same breath. Kipri queued both motions, stamped them, and kept the evidence stream running without pause. The next challenge arrived before the previous rebuttal finished rendering. Then another, each answered, logged, and folded into the widening record. The chamber shifted from accusation theater to forensic combat in plain view. No one could pretend this was one technician's rogue patch anymore. House Talar attempted procedural flank. Then remove the human and continue under proper interpreter lineage. The words hit like a slap and like a gift, because they were so nakedly class-coded that half the room recoiled. Sareth's answer came low and precise. Request denied. He remains under my den right and operational command until the session is secured. She glanced at Isabella then, finally, and in that glance, he read, not affection, not ownership, but deliberate dependency acknowledged without embarrassment. She needed his ear and hands. He needed her authority and shield, mutual, explicit, and witnessed. Voice engineer, she said, loud enough for all tears, advise this chamber what must happen next if we intend to sign anything today. He looked at the floating matrices, the old lies, the live feeds, the red bar holding at 58 and threatening to climb if rhetoric got lazy again. He heard the coolant thrum, smelled wet stone and cold tonic and singed insulation, felt the residual pressure of her brief grip still printed into his forearm. Next, he said, projecting from diaphragm the way drill sergeants once taught him to be heard over failing hull fans. We run a supervised calibration pass with crosscast speakers, log every output publicly, and lock Kipri war routines behind dual auth oversight for the remainder of treaty language. No closed doors, no purity slogans, just evidence, procedure, and people who can admit the machine was wrong. Silence held for one taut beat. Then Kipri replied, proposed protocol is compliant with emergency continuity and audit law. Sareth inclined her head. Proceed. The conflict had not vanished. It had changed shape into work. He stepped to the central pickup and called the first calibration line while legal projectors still glowed with accusation script. Shared intent, plain register, no titles, he said. Maris, then Havel, then Irn. The three Felinari stood again, shoulders rigid, and spoke into the chamber in their own cadences. Lower house clipped vowels, clerk-neutral diction, military economy. Kipri parsed each line in visible layers now, every weighting exposed, every confidence score public. Isabella watched for the old twitch toward hostility and felt his pulse slow when the markers settled at conciliatory, uncertain, neutral, not threat. He rotated to trade and doc can't test phrases, then had a human legal aid repeat a formal apology and a dock worker condolence idiom that had triggered trouble for years. The hall listened as the same words were finally rendered as grief, not aggression. Around the tiers, postures changed in tiny increments, claws retracting, shoulders dropping, tails uncurling from ankles. Second pass, he said. Hard mode. Add lineage reference with honor syntax and a war loss clause. Reth's elder gave him a look that could have peeled paint. You will not experiment on court language. Sareth answered before Isabella opened his mouth. He will validate court language. Sit. The elder sat with visible effort. Isabella keyed in the phrase family and nodded to a military widow seated 3 rows back, silver throat cord frayed at one edge. She spoke in a voice rough with old smoke. Kepri flagged elevated emotional intensity, then correctly separated mourning from threat. A sound moved through the military benches. Not relief exactly, more like collective disbelief, discovering it had somewhere to stand. 40 minutes after Sereth had granted Denright, the West Triage door reopened, and the interpreter was wheeled back to the threshold on a low grav chair, wrapped in warming foil and med leads. She looked pale, furious, and alive. One medic lifted a hand for silence. "She is stable and conscious for limited testimony," the medic said. 2 minutes. The interpreter touched the neck halo that had shocked her and met Isabella's eyes. "The phrase I was rendering was, 'funeral courtesy for lost crews,'" she said, each word deliberate. Kipri translated it as, "coordinated retaliation intent." I tried to correct. It hit me with recursive feedback. Isabella sent her statement to the main display and tagged it Eyewitness Primary. Physical evidence followed seconds later. A chamber drone descended with a sealed micro tray from Rapid Materials Analysis, carrying the particulate vial he had submitted. The report projected above it. Conduit. C-sealant carbonized from chronic microarc. Aging profile consistent with deferred maintenance. No sabotage compounds detected. He lifted the tray for the cameras. Sample resolved. Stored with report under 441A. Entered and locked, the central clerk confirmed. One thread closed, then another. The same clerk opened 6 archived deferral dockets the chamber had ignored and read each signature aloud, including the committee chair who had marked lane emitter recalibration non-urgent during budget season. No one applauded. The sound of names was punishment enough. House Talar tried once more. Procedure failures do not justify public humiliation. Sereth's stare did not move. They justify public correction. She raised her signet hand and the legal rail mirrored her seal across every active screen. By wartime continuity authority and crown-adjacent mandate, I censure Houses Reth, Towler, and Sen for obstruction during active safety remediation. Penalty: loss of procedural priority for this session, compulsory contribution to Translator Overhaul Fund, and formal apology entered in all 3 working languages. The apology requirement drew more outrage than the funding. Isabella almost admired the precision. Kipri verified the censure path as lawful. The 3 houses filed protest packets anyway. Kipri queued them for post-session review and kept the main track open. Procedure, not drama. The room held. By the time the station chronometer rolled to second shift, the calibration suite had run 12 crosscast loops without escalation. Isabella kept one hand on the panel edge and one on his slate, listening for drift in the subharmonic ticks. They were gone. In their place came boring machine sounds, coolant hum, relay click, legal key chatter. He had never loved boring more. "Status check," Sereth said quietly at his shoulder. War routines locked behind dual auth, live logs mirrored to all delegations, sent lanes corrected with temporary offsets, permanent replacement ordered, he said. If someone wants a fight now, they'll have to do it with their own words. Her ears angled in that near smile shape again. Progress. The signing itself happened without ceremony first, then with ceremony layered on top. Delegates stepped in sequence to the central rail, pressed signets or palms to the accord plate, and spoke the continuity clauses into the repaired channel. Isabella interpreted when needed and refused to embroider. Trade stayed trade. Court stayed court. Grief stayed grief. When Reth's elder reached his line, he paused, jaw tight, and delivered the mandated apology in stiff trade. His loaded look from earlier finally paid out as plain admission. "We relied on a system we did not inspect," he said. That failure harmed this chamber. He did not look at Isabella while saying it, but he said it on record. That counted. At the rear tier, the junior ambassador who had pocketed his signet in the first panic approached during a handover pause, pale and formal. "Technician Torres," he said, voice low. "I removed my seal earlier to avoid being bound to a possible purge order. I have re-entered full signature. I did not disclose that then." He swallowed. "I disclose it now for the record." Isabella studied him for a beat and nodded toward the nearest mic. "Put it there. Not to me." The ambassador did, and the clerk logged it as supplemental witness statement. Another loose thread tied down in daylight. When the final delegation spoke, Kepri announced, "Accord text complete. Multi-party ratification threshold exceeded. Treaty active." No one cheered immediately. People exhaled. Some sat down hard. One human aide cried silently into both hands. A Felinari guard on the north lane closed her eyes for 3 breaths, then resumed posture like nothing had happened. Sereth turned to Isabella as legal drones began distributing authenticated copies. Last task. He knew before she pointed. Kepri's core housing sat behind the chamber wall in a glassed alcove, old black chassis under polished trim. The wartime adjudication package now visible as an amber module pulsing like a bad tooth. Dismantling it had been demanded in open session. Doing it now would keep the promise honest. Engineering crew arrived from lower decks in patched jackets and scuffed boots, Juno among them, carrying lockout kits. Isabella walked with them to the alcove under full camera witness. He read the shutdown sequence aloud so no one could claim tampering. Archive export complete. Legal mirrors verified. Emergency translation shell transferred to interim civic stack. War module isolated. Sereth provided the second authentication with her signet. Together, they turned 2 physical keys inset beneath the housing lip. The amber module went dark. No thunder. No cinematic collapse. Just the clean click of relays opening and the end of a machine habit that had lasted too long. Juno let out a breath like a punctured tire and said, "Well, that antique just retired." "Without a pension," Isabella said. "Bureaucracy'll invoice it anyway." Dry laughter flickered through the crew and faded. They lifted the war module into a sealed evidence case stamped for independent audit, logged destination, and dispatched it to the oversight vault. Physical item tracked. Outcome explicit. The chamber emptied in layers after that, rank by rank, species by species. Cold tonic was finally replaced with hot. Someone set a cup beside Isabella's slate, without a word. He drank and tasted bitter leaf, metal, and exhaustion. Sereth stood near the rail speaking with Med Command, then with the legal clerk, then with a gray-furred elder who had given her a loaded, unreadable stare all cycle. At last, the elder approached Isabella directly. "I watched you when the first alarm hit," the elder said in careful trade. "I had thought your silence was fear. It was listening." He touched 2 fingers to his brow. "I was wrong. Recorded." He turned away before Isabella could answer. Not warm, not friendly, but true. Good enough. The interpreter, steadier now, paused beside Isabella's station on her way out. "You took my place without stealing it," she said. "That is rare." "You coming back next session?" he asked. She bared the smallest hint of fangs, this time in humor. "If they let me bring my own hardware." "Bring 2. At last, only cleanup crews, clerks, and command remained. Sereth approached with a formal tablet in one hand, and her hidden tremor finally visible in the other, now that rivals were gone. She did not hide it from him. "This is the post order," she said. "Cross-species voice engineer, treaty tier, joint authority between my command and Civic Translation Office. Not honorary. Paid. Protected. You will train teams so this does not hinge on one body again. He took the tablet and read every line, because contracts were where systems tried to get even. Hazard clauses, audit rights, independent whistle channel, medical override language for command staff during high hostility sessions. He glanced up at that line. I added that, she said, following his eyes. Your preventive maintenance request was correct. A primary consideration settled in him then, heavy and clean. He had come in wanting anonymity, to fix a machine and disappear. The multifaceted truth was that disappearing had helped build the conditions that nearly killed people today. Staying would be harder. Staying might matter. He signed. Sarith signed second, then extended her forearm in the same controlled grip she had used to steady him earlier. This time, the gesture was private, though still in view of workers who pretended not to watch. Shared duty, Torres, she said. Shared duty, Commander. They released at the same moment. Outside the chamber, station night cycle lights shifted from emergency red to working white, and the air no longer smelled like panic trying to become law. It smelled like coolant, hot leaf tonic, wet stone, and a maintenance crew already arguing about emitter replacements. The Accord stood. The machine that nearly broke it was boxed for audit, and two people from incompatible hierarchies walked out side by side toward the translation lab because peace, in this place, had to be engineered every day.